Hello there, and welcome to Cosmic Slumber. Tonight, once again, we are setting aside the usual 100 quiet facts and settling instead into a single long, gentle story, the kind best listened to with your eyes already closed and your blankets already pulled up warm around your shoulders. It is the story of a small-town library and the strange, quiet magic that settles over it every night at the stroke of midnight, when its doors swing open to visitors no ordinary daytime library could ever hope to welcome. There is nothing frightening waiting in these pages. Nothing urgent needs solving before morning. It is simply a soft, unhurried tale about a patient librarian, a great many curious visitors, and a particular kind of quiet magic that only ever seems to happen once the rest of the world has gone properly to sleep. If you enjoy these gentle journeys, I invite you to like, subscribe, or leave a thought below. It helps other sleepy minds find their way here, too, one quiet story at a time. But for now, all you need to do is relax. Let your shoulders soften. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your breathing slow, deep and even, as we drift together into the story of the library that only opens at midnight. Let's begin. In a small town tucked between two gentle hills, where the streets grew quiet not long after sunset and the street lamps hummed softly against the dark, there stood a library. By day, it looked like any other library in any other small town, a tidy brick building with tall windows and a green door, its shelves stocked with the sort of ordinary, sensible books any visitor might expect to find, atlases and cookbooks and well-loved novels with cracked spines. But the library kept a secret, one known only to a small handful of townsfolk who happened to notice, or who happened to be told by someone who already knew. Each night, at the very stroke of midnight, once the last lamp in every house along the street had finally gone dark, the library's green door would unlock itself, quietly and without any fuss at all, and the shelves inside would begin, very slowly, to shift and rearrange themselves, making room for an entirely different sort of visitor than the library saw during its ordinary daytime hours. The library's keeper was a woman named Ottilie, who had tended its shelves for so many years that even she had begun to lose precise count, though she remembered clearly enough the first night, decades before, when she had stayed late finishing some quiet paperwork and had looked up, startled, to find the clock striking midnight and the front door swinging softly open on its own. She had been frightened, that very first night, watching the shelves creak and shift in the moonlight, until a small, polite knock had sounded at the door, and she had opened it to find, waiting patiently on the front step, a fox in a neat little waistcoat, holding a tattered, dog-eared book he wished very much to return. "I do apologize for the late hour," the fox had said, with perfect courtesy, "but this is really the only hour I'm ever able to visit. I do hope that isn't too terrible an inconvenience." Ottilie, who had always considered herself a sensible, practical sort of person, had taken one long, careful look at the polite fox in his neat waistcoat, and had decided, in that particular moment, that sensible practicality could very well stretch to accommodate a talking fox with excellent manners and a genuine love of books. She had taken his returned volume, checked it back onto the shelf exactly as she would any ordinary book, and asked, in her calmest possible voice, whether he might be interested in borrowing something new before he went on his way. That had been the beginning of everything, and in all the years since, Ottilie had never once regretted her decision to simply accept the library's strange midnight magic rather than question it too closely. Each night now, once the ordinary daytime visitors had gone home and the green door had locked itself for the evening, she would settle in behind the front desk with a cup of tea, waiting for the clock to strike 12, and for whichever curious, book-loving creatures the night happened to bring her way. The particular night this story concerns began, as most midnight library nights did, with the soft, familiar creak of the shelves shifting to make room for whatever new arrivals were on their way. Ottilie, settled comfortably behind her desk with her tea cooling gently beside her, watched the reference section slide quietly several feet to the left, revealing a previously hidden alcove stocked entirely with small, leather-bound books written in a shimmering silver script she had never quite learned to read herself. The first visitor of the evening arrived precisely as the clock finished its 12th chime, exactly as the library's visitors always seemed to manage, however far they happened to be travelling from. It was a young badger, considerably smaller than most of her kind, wearing a soft blue scarf wrapped twice around her neck against the evening chill, standing rather shyly at the threshold of the green door. "I'm looking for a book about the stars," the badger said, once Ottilie had welcomed her inside with her usual warm, unhurried greeting. "My grandmother used to tell me their names, before she passed, but I've forgotten so many of them now, and I miss hearing her voice say them properly." Ottilie considered this for a moment, then rose from her desk and led the young badger toward the newly revealed alcove of silver-script books, running one careful finger along the spines until she found a slim volume that seemed, somehow, to hum faintly beneath her touch, the way certain books in the Midnight Collection sometimes did when they had found exactly the right reader. "Try this one," Ottilie said, passing the book gently into the badger's paws. "I believe it might have exactly what you're looking for." The badger settled herself into a comfortable reading chair near the tall front windows, opening the slim volume with careful, hopeful hands, and as she read, Her small face slowly brightened, the names of long-forgotten constellations rising up from the page exactly as her grandmother had once spoken them, warm and familiar, as though the book itself somehow remembered the particular voice she had been missing. "This is perfect," she whispered, mostly to herself, tracing one paw gently along a line of silver script. "This is exactly right." Ottilie, watching from a respectful distance, felt the particular quiet satisfaction that came, night after night, from matching precisely the right book to precisely the reader who needed it most, a satisfaction she had never quite managed to explain properly to anyone who had never experienced the library's peculiar midnight magic for themselves. The badger stayed a good while longer, reading quietly by the window, before finally checking her book out properly, promising to return it once she had finished, exactly the way any ordinary library patron might, and slipping back out through the green door into the quiet night, considerably lighter in her step than she had arrived. No sooner had the badger gone than a second visitor arrived, this one a pair of twin mice, dressed identically in tiny matching coats, who explained, both talking at once in their eager, overlapping way, that they were searching for a book to help settle an argument that had apparently been raging between their two families for several generations, concerning the proper way to store winter grain. Ottilie, who had learned over many years never to underestimate the seriousness with which the library's visitors approached even their smallest disputes, led the two mice toward a shelf of practical, sensible reference volumes tucked near the back of the main room, and helped them locate, after a careful search, an old agricultural guide that settled the matter, apparently, quite definitively in favor of neither family's original method, but of an entirely different, better approach that both mice agreed, with visible relief, to bring back to their respective grandparents. "This will save us years of arguing," one twin said gratefully, tucking the borrowed book carefully under one small arm. "Years," the other agreed solemnly, and the two of them departed together, already deep in excited discussion about exactly how their families would react to this unexpected resolution. And so the evening continued, visitor after gentle visitor arriving at the stroke of each passing hour, each one seeking something particular, something the library's strange midnight collection seemed always, somehow, prepared to offer. An elderly owl came searching for poetry to read at his granddaughter's wedding, and left, eventually, with a slim volume of verses that seemed to shimmer faintly in the moonlight, exactly suited to the occasion. A nervous young rabbit came seeking a book that might help her overcome her fear of the dark, and Ottilie guided her toward a gentle, illustrated volume that seemed to glow softly from within, its pages filled with stories of creatures who had faced their own fears and found, gradually, their own particular courage. It was well past 2 in the morning, in the particular deep, quiet stretch of night when even the library's midnight visitors grew fewer and further between, that Ottilie noticed a new arrival standing rather uncertainly just inside the green door, having entered so quietly she had almost missed the moment of his arrival entirely. He was an old tortoise, moving with the slow, careful deliberation of considerable age, his shell weathered and faintly cracked in places, and he stood for a long moment simply looking around at the library's shifted, moonlit shelves with an expression Ottilie recognized at once, having seen some version of it many times over her years of tending the midnight collection. It was the particular look of someone who had come searching for something they were not entirely certain the library, or perhaps anyone, could actually provide. "Can I help you find something?" Ottilie asked gently, approaching at her own unhurried pace, matching, without quite meaning to, the old tortoise's own slow and careful manner. He was quiet for a long moment before answering, his old eyes taking in the whole shifted, midnight shape of the library around him. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted eventually. "I've outlived most everyone I once knew, you understand. My whole generation, more or less, has gone on ahead of me by now. I came here tonight hoping, foolishly perhaps, that a library might have some book that could tell me what to do with all these years I seem to have left, now that so much of what filled my earlier ones has quietly slipped away." Ottilie considered this carefully, feeling the particular weight of the old tortoise's quiet, honest request settle gently over her. She had, in all her years tending the midnight library, learned that its shifting shelves seemed to respond, somehow, to exactly this kind of genuine, searching need, even when the visitor themselves was not entirely certain what shape the answer might take. "Come with me," she said softly, and led him, at his own slow pace, deeper into the library than she usually ventured with midnight visitors, past the reference section and the silver-script alcove, toward a small, quiet corner near the very back of the building that Ottilie had noticed, over the years, only seemed to properly reveal itself to visitors who truly needed what it held. There, tucked into a modest shelf between two tall windows that looked out over the sleeping town, was a small collection of books unlike any others in the library's midnight collection, their covers plain and unadorned, their titles written not in silver script but in simple, warm brown ink. Ottilie had never read any of them herself, understanding somehow, without ever being explicitly told, that this particular shelf was not meant for her. The old tortoise approached slowly, running one weathered claw along the spines until he paused at a slim volume near the shelf center, its plain brown cover bearing no title at all, only a small, embossed image of a tree with roots spreading as wide and deep as its branches reached high. He drew it down carefully and opened it, and Ottilie, watching from a respectful distance, saw something shift gently in his old, tired face as he read, his shoulders slowly easing, his expression softening from its earlier uncertain searching into something calmer, something closer to quiet recognition. "What does it say?" she asked eventually, unable to help her own gentle curiosity, though she was careful to keep her voice soft and unintrusive. The old tortoise looked up from the page, his eyes somehow both tired and warmer than before. "It says that a tree's oldest roots don't stop mattering just because new branches have grown up above them," he said slowly. "It says the years I've already lived aren't finished doing their work, even now, even with so many of the people who shared them gone on ahead of me. It says the roots keep feeding the whole tree, quietly, whether anyone above ground remembers to notice or not." He was quiet for a long moment, holding the small book gently in his weathered claws. "I think," he said eventually, "that I needed to hear that rather more than I realized, coming in here tonight." Ottilie said nothing, only nodded gently, understanding, as she always eventually came to understand with the library's most searching midnight visitors, that some books did not need any further explanation once they had found precisely the reader they were always meant for. The old tortoise stayed a good while longer that night, reading slowly through the small brown volume by the light of the tall back windows, while Ottilie returned to her desk and her now thoroughly cooled cup of tea, content to leave him to his quiet reading, checking in only once, gently, to ask whether he might like a fresh, warm cup of his own. He accepted gratefully, and when he finally rose to leave, some time later, considerably closer to dawn than to midnight by then, he paused at the front desk to thank her properly, his old voice steadier and warmer than it had been on his arrival. "I don't suppose I could borrow this," he said, holding up the small brown volume, "though I understand if a book like this one isn't meant to leave its particular shelf." Ottilie considered this seriously, feeling, as she often did with the library's most important midnight decisions, a quiet certainty settle over her that had little to do with any ordinary library rule. "I think," she said slowly, "that book has already given you what it needed to tonight. But you're welcome to visit it again, whenever you like. I have a feeling it isn't quite finished with you yet." The old tortoise smiled, slow and genuine, and made his careful way back out through the green door into the last deep hours of the night, moving, Ottilie noticed, with rather more lightness in his old, weathered shell than he had carried on his arrival. As the sky outside the tall windows began, very gradually, to lighten from deep black toward the soft grey that came just before proper dawn, the library's shifted shelves began, slowly and quietly, to creak back into their ordinary daytime positions, the silver-script alcove folding itself away, the plain brown shelf at the back retreating once more into whatever quiet space it occupied between one midnight and the next. Ottilie finished the last of her second cup of tea, tidied the front desk exactly as she always did before the ordinary daytime hours began, and settled herself for a short doze in her favorite reading chair, as was her own particular habit, before the library's green door would unlock itself again, this time for its ordinary morning visitors, the townsfolk arriving for their atlases and cookbooks and well-loved novels with cracked spines, entirely unaware, as most of them always were, of exactly what strange, gentle magic had passed through those same shelves only a few short hours before. She thought, as she drifted toward her own brief morning sleep, of the young badger and her grandmother's remembered constellations, of the twin mice and their generations-old grain dispute, of the elderly owl's wedding poetry and the nervous rabbit's gentle courage, and of the old tortoise, most of all, and the quiet brown book that had reminded him, so gently, that his own long roots were still doing their patient, important work, even now. This was, she reflected, drifting further toward sleep, rather the whole quiet purpose of the library's strange midnight hours, not simply to lend out books, but to offer, to whichever curious, searching visitor happened to arrive at whichever particular hour they most needed it, exactly the right words, waiting patiently on exactly the right shelf, ready to be found the moment someone was finally ready to look. There was another particular night, some weeks after the old tortoise's quiet visit, that Ottilie liked to remember fondly whenever she thought back over her many years tending the midnight library, a night that began, much like any other, with the soft creak of shifting shelves at the stroke of 12, but which unfolded, before it was through, into something rather more complicated than her usual gentle evening of matching books to visitors. The trouble arrived, quite literally, in the form of two visitors who came through the green door at almost precisely the same moment, nearly colliding in the doorway in their haste, both looking considerably flustered and both talking over one another in their eagerness to be helped first. One was a hedgehog, small and prickly with worry, clutching an armful of hastily gathered notes. The other was a heron, tall and elegant even in her obvious distress, holding a single crumpled page as though it might dissolve entirely if she loosened her grip even slightly. "I do apologize," Ottilie said, raising both hands gently to calm the sudden flurry of overlapping words, "but I'm afraid I can only properly understand one worried visitor at a time. Perhaps we might take turns." The hedgehog and the heron exchanged a brief, slightly embarrassed glance, and the heron, with the particular graceful courtesy her kind was known for, gestured for the hedgehog to go first. "I'm supposed to give a speech," the hedgehog explained, her small paws trembling slightly as she smoothed her armful of notes. "Tomorrow, at my niece's graduation from the Young Foragers Academy. I've been asked to speak on behalf of the whole extended family, and I have absolutely no idea what to say, and I've written 4 different drafts already, and none of them feel remotely right, and the ceremony is in less than 12 hours. "And you?" Ottilie asked gently, turning to the heron, once the hedgehog had finished a breathless explanation. "Much the same difficulty, in truth," the heron admitted, smoothing her single crumpled page with visible effort at composure. "I am to deliver the opening address at the River Council's annual gathering, at dawn, and I find myself, after decades of public speaking, suddenly and entirely without the proper words. I don't know quite what's come over me. I've given this same address, more or less, every year for longer than I care to admit, and tonight it simply refuses to come." Ottilie considered the two of them for a long moment, turning over in her mind the particular way the library's shifting shelves tended to respond most helpfully when she understood clearly, first, exactly what shape of trouble she was dealing with. Both visitors, she realized, were facing not merely a search for the right words, but something closer to a sudden, sharp collision with their own uncertainty, arriving at nearly the very same hour, as though the night itself had decided the two of them needed to face that particular trouble together. "I wonder," she said slowly, "whether the two of you might actually be more help to each other than anything I could pull down from a shelf. Would you be willing to sit together for a few minutes, and simply tell each other what it is you're actually trying to say, before we go looking for the proper words to say it in?" The hedgehog and the heron, both a little surprised by the suggestion, nonetheless agreed, and Ottilie settled them into 2 comfortable chairs near the front window, offering each a cup of tea before retreating a polite distance to give them space to talk. "Go on, then," the heron said, after a moment of slightly awkward silence. "Tell me about your niece. What is it you actually want the ceremony to know about her?" The hedgehog considered this, turning her notes over uncertainly in her paws. "She's the first in our whole family to graduate top of her class," she said slowly. "Her mother, my sister, worked 3 jobs most winters just to keep her fed and warm enough to study properly. Nobody expected a family like ours to produce a forager who could outperform half the academy's usual top students. I suppose I just want everyone to understand what that actually took. Not just cleverness. Years and years of somebody quietly making sure she had the chance to use it." "That's your speech, then," the heron said simply. "Right there. Not the 4 drafts you've already written, I'd wager, but exactly what you just told me." The hedgehog blinked, considering this. It felt too plain, she admitted. Too simple, compared to the grand speeches other families usually give. "Plain and true beats grand and hollow, in my considerable experience," the heron said. "Now, might I trouble you to listen to mine in return? I find myself in rather the same tangle." And so the hedgehog listened, patiently, while the heron explained, haltingly at first and then with growing clarity, that after so many years of the same practiced address to the River Council, she had realized, only that very evening, that she no longer entirely believed the confident, well-worn word she had always used, that the river itself had changed considerably over her many years of speaking for it, and that perhaps, for the first time, her opening address needed to say something honest about that change rather than simply repeating what had always, comfortably, been said before. "Then say that," the hedgehog said, with the same simple certainty the heron had offered her only minutes before. "Say the river's changed, and you've changed watching it, and the council deserves to hear that honestly, instead of the same comfortable words you've always given them." By the time the clock struck 1, both visitors had found, between them, considerably more clarity than either had managed alone in their earlier hours of anxious drafting, and Ottilie, watching quietly from behind her desk, felt once again that particular satisfaction of watching the library's midnight magic work in a way no single shelf or book could ever quite have managed on its own. "I don't suppose you have a book on public speaking, even so," the heron said, rising at last to gather her things, "just in case my nerve fails me again before dawn." Ottilie smiled and led her toward a shelf near the front of the library, and the hedgehog toward another nearby, and both visitors left, some minutes later, with borrowed books tucked carefully under their arms and considerably steadier resolve than they had carried through the door that same night. Not every midnight visitor arrived with quite so tangled a trouble, of course, and Ottilie treasured, just as much, the quieter, simpler visits that filled most of her long nights tending the shifting shelves. There was the evening a young fox-kit, barely old enough to read on her own, arrived clutching her father's paw, searching for nothing more complicated than a story to help her fall asleep more easily, and left, some time later, glowing with pride over the very first book she had ever finished entirely by herself. There was the night a pair of elderly beavers arrived, celebrating an anniversary neither could quite believe had arrived so quickly, searching simply for a book of old love poems to read aloud to one another beside the library's tall front windows, their voices low and fond in the moonlight. And there was, perhaps most memorably of all that particular season, the visit of a small, spectacled mole named Fenwick, who arrived one quiet Tuesday night not searching for any book at all, but simply, he explained rather shyly, because he had heard rumors of the library's strange midnight hours and had always wanted, more than almost anything, simply to see it for himself. "I don't need to borrow anything," he assured Ottilie, standing rather awkwardly just inside the green door. "I only wanted to see if the stories were true, about the shelves moving, and all the different visitors. I do hope that isn't a terrible waste of your evening." Ottilie, who had long ago decided that curiosity alone was every bit as worthy a reason to visit the Midnight Library as any specific need, welcomed him in warmly and gave him a proper, unhurried tour of the shifted shelves, showing him the silver-script alcove and explaining, as best she could, the particular quiet magic of the plain brown shelf near the back, though she was careful, as always, not to lead him too near it unless he seemed genuinely called to it himself. Fenwick left, hours later, without borrowing a single book, but with an expression of such pure, satisfied wonder that Ottilie found herself thinking of his visit often in the weeks that followed, a reminder that the library's midnight magic was never really only about the books themselves, but about the particular gentle permission it offered every visitor, borrower, and curious wanderer alike, simply to arrive exactly as they were, and be welcomed exactly the same way in return. As the seasons turned, one into another, Ottilie noticed something she had not quite expected when she first accepted the library's strange midnight magic all those years before, back on that first startled night when a polite fox in a neat waistcoat had knocked so courteously at her door. She noticed that certain visitors began returning, not just once, to borrow a single needed book, but again and again, across months and sometimes years, until the Midnight Library came to feel, gradually, less like a place of occasional strange emergencies and more like a genuine, ongoing community of its own, existing quietly alongside the ordinary daytime world most of the town never even suspected. The young badger with the blue scarf returned every few months, working her way slowly through the entire silver-script astronomy collection, and Ottilie watched her grow, visit by visit, from a shy, grieving child into a confident young scholar who could, by her third year of visits, recite whole constellations from memory without ever opening a single book at all. The old Tortoise returned as well, precisely as Ottilie had suspected he might, drawn back again and again to the plain brown shelf at the library's rear, though he confided to her, on one particular visit, that he found himself needing it rather less often as the seasons passed, and simply enjoyed, more and more, sitting quietly near the tall back windows regardless of whether he pulled any book down at all. "I think," he told her, on that particular evening, "I've mostly said what I needed to say to myself, thanks to that first small book. Now I mostly just come because I like the company. Yours, and the quiet, and whichever other creature happens to be reading nearby." Ottilie understood this completely, having felt something rather similar herself across all her many years tending the shifting shelves. The library's true magic, she had come to believe, was never really only about matching the right book to the right reader at the right desperate hour, however much good that particular magic managed to do. It was about the whole slow, patient community that grew up gradually around that magic, night after quiet night, visitor after returning visitor, until a small brick building with a green door became, for a great many curious creatures across the surrounding hills, something rather closer to a second, quieter kind of home. Some nights, especially in the deepest, quietest hours well past midnight, when the last visitor had gone and dawn still felt comfortably far away, Ottilie liked to walk slowly through the shifted shelves alone, running her fingers along spines she had watched 100 different creatures borrow and return over the years, feeling, in those quiet solitary moments, the particular warm satisfaction of tending something that mattered so gently and so deeply to so many, even though hardly anyone in the ordinary daytime world would ever fully understand exactly what those nighttime hours held. Now, if you happen to still be listening, perhaps your own eyes have grown just as heavy as Ottilie's did that quiet morning, settled into her favorite reading chair as the last of the midnight magic folded itself gently away around her. Perhaps you can imagine it too, that same soft, shifting library, its shelves rearranging themselves in the moonlight, waiting patiently for whichever quiet, searching visitor might need its help tonight. Let your breathing slow, the way the whole midnight library slowed toward dawn, its shelves settling gently back into their ordinary places. Let your shoulders soften, the way the old Tortoise's shoulders softened, reading slowly by the light of the tall back windows. Let whatever question or worry you carried into tonight settle quietly onto its own particular waiting shelf, ready to be found again only once you're properly ready to look for it. Somewhere, in a small town tucked between two gentle hills, a library is standing quiet and unassuming behind its tidy green door, its ordinary daytime shelves giving no hint at all of the gentle magic that will return again tonight, at the very stroke of midnight, for whichever curious visitor happens to need it most. And you, wherever you are resting tonight, are always welcome there too, whenever you happen to need it, waiting patiently, exactly like every other quiet, searching visitor before you. If you enjoyed this story, perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share a thought below. It helps other curious minds, and other sleepy little ones, find their way here, too, one quiet story at a time. And if you happen to still be awake, there will be another gentle story waiting for you next time, another cozy corner of an imagined world to drift into slowly. But for now, let your mind grow still, and let the day fall away. Sleep well, and good night.